Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I'm going to get acquainted with somebody I already know, if you can put it that way. This is Saul Arbess, whom I have known a little bit for a long, long time, but we've never had a real long personal conversation. Now, this doesn't have to be real personal, but at least I want to get to know him as an academic as well as a peace activist, which is how I've known him so far. Saul Arbess is in Victoria, British Columbia, and he is I gather, a retired anthropologist. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
By the way, as you know, I'm a retired sociologist. So
I
in
do know
some
that.
universities, they throw us into the same department, sociology and anthropology, or
Okay.
anthropology and sociology. But that wasn't in any department I've ever been in. How about you?
Yes, I've been in departments where they have combined those disciplines. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
So what's your own background in your own profession?
well, I'm basically an Arctic anthropologist. I had a lifelong interest in the Inuit, and
Really?
I, when I had the opportunity as a graduate student in anthropology at McGill University, actually, I was McGill's first PhD in
Really?
cultural anthropology,
Huh.
and that in 1968,
Uh-huh.
all those years ago. And I did both a master's degree and a PhD on rapid social change among Inuit communities of the Eastern Arctic. And I have worked in that field ever since. I participated, actually, I created more or less the first Aboriginal teacher training program in Canada uh, with the Inuit of Northern Quebec in those years, in 1972, 1973,
Mhm.
which became a program for training Inuit people to become teachers, and which has worked very, very well for them. And today, most of the teachers at the elementary school level are Inuit.
Most of the teachers teaching Inuit
Right.
elementary school children are themselves Inuit.
Exactly.
Huh.
Yeah, that was the goal, and that's what has been achieved, not by me, but by people who came later.
Where do they get trained?
Well, actually, McGill University was the principal institution, and the trainings take place in Kuujjuaq, also known as Fort Chimo, which is kind of the regional center in northern Quebec.
Hmm.
And so it has prospered. They have their own school board. It's within the provincial system, the Katavik school board, uh, where last I looked, all of the members, or all except maybe one of the members, are Inuit themselves.
Mhm.
It's been quite a success story, and
Really?
but this goes back to that period, which when the teacher training programs, Native Indian teacher education training programs, were established at UBC and some other universities, University of Saskatchewan as well. So that really began my work in applied anthropology, because that's really what I've done. That's how I've related activism and academia is through the field, through applied anthropology. And later I became, uh, actually for 7 years, I was the provincial director of First Nations education for the province of British Columbia. And
Hmm.
that was an extremely exciting year, because there was very little attention when I came to culturally compatible education for Inuit children in public schools.
Do they
And
use their own language with the small children, or do they start off right away in English and French?
well, there's two different situations here. So for the Kativik School Board in Northern Quebec, Inuktitut is used exclusively in the first three, more or less exclusively in the first 3 years, in the primary years. and then they phase in it English, but Inuktitut is always a language, one of the languages of instruction in that program.
Well, what about reading and writing in Inuktitut? Is there much for them to use?
And yes, actually, they have their own language, own written language.
I know they have their own language, but that doesn't mean that they have a lot of books written in that language, I wouldn't think. You're not going to get
there's not a lot of books written in that language, but you know, they were taught a system called syllabics, which is a system where rather than you have a single letter having a meaning, it's done in a syllabic form. So the idea initially was that the Inuit, it would be too complex to use the Roman orthography, would be too complex for the Inuit. That, of course, was a myth. But nonetheless, the gift of written language was brought in by a Reverend Peck in the 19th century. And since then, the Inuit have convened meetings to improve the precision of that language. Syllabics is not precise. So they have they use a number of inscripts and other markings to make the language more precise. And Inuktitut is very much a thriving language. I mean, along with Cree, these are the most substantially utilized indigenous languages in the country. So they have retained their language. And in the programs that we developed, there's a tremendous emphasis on traditional skill learning. The school, even the school year is altered to allow for the hunting in the spring, on the seal hunting on the ice in the spring of each year. Mm-hmm. So that we've seen tremendous improvements in the whole education system for Inuit speaking children.
Let's go on to talking about the Canadian initiative for the Department of Peace. This first time I met you was in connection with that initiative, and I know that you have continued as much as anybody to press it forward. Can you give our listeners a précis of what all has gone on, what the whole thing's about?
First of all, I want to remember that at a meeting that you came in Toronto or Ottawa, I think, about the peace initiative, you were a very strong supporter of it. And I remember you were quite upset with some of the sort of questions people raised, doubts that people raised at the time and so forth. And you were, I still remember that and appreciate it a great deal. Well, the initiative is doing very well, actually. The big goal, of course, was to create a federal minister of peace and a cabinet level position. We have not achieved that. Actually, the interesting point is that in two different years, in 2009 and 2011, we had introduced private members' bills. And it turned out, actually, that all the parties supported the Department of Peace except the party in power, which, of course, was the Conservative Party. To this day, we've never succeeded either with a senator or with a member of parliament to ever support a Department of Peace. Be that known. Not a single one. Even some of the progressive conservatives that became senators, we could not get them to support our initiative.
Okay, but now are you saying that as of then, the Liberals also supported it and only the Conservatives refused?
The Liberals were a little equivocal on it, but fundamentally, yes, we met with the Liberals, and there was very strong support for the initiative at that time. Yes, this goes.
Doesn't sound like the government of our day, which is a liberal government.
I don't think this government. We're talking about 2009, 2011.
I know, that's what I'm thinking. The contrast, when Trudeau came to power, he said something about Canada is back. I think the Liberals are not nearly as progressive as they promised they would be. Although maybe when it comes to the position on the nuclear prohibition treaty, they're softening a little bit, and we'll see if we get somewhere with that. We should say what this, a little more about the Department of Peace Initiative globally, because we're not the only ones who thought of such an idea.
That's right. So in around 2000, in 2005, actually, in the early stages, really, of our initiative, the American initiative through the Peace Alliance, and the British initiative that existed at the same time for a Minister for Peace. The three countries met in London and created in that year the Global Alliance for Ministries and Infrastructures for Peace, GAMIP. And GAMIP actually has over 50 member countries, including countries that have a Minister of Peace, which would include Costa Rica, which has been the most successful of all of them. Mm-hmm. So we created GAMIP, and GAMIP subsequently has held actually global conferences on 5 continents. And it has moved along quite a bit, and we have stimulated directly, actually, the creation of the Minister for Peace in Costa Rica through our members there. As a result of people attending our conferences, the Minister of Peace and Reconciliation, that reconstruction that was established in Nepal, unfortunately, it has been ended, but it was full of promise at the time, very much supported by the Maoists after the civil conflict of many, many years. It was supported by all parties, but it became, I don't know, I can't speak personally to that because I hadn't visited, but it became highly politicized in a way that was considered not beneficial. But what they did succeed in doing is creating at the local level what we call local peace committees throughout the country. In almost every village and almost every place, they had these local peace committees made up of people who were locally recognized and respected in the community from all sides. And the local peace committees were quite successful for a period of time, but that has been dropped now in Nepal, and I can't speak to the actual detail of it. Actually, more recently, and again, unfortunately, events seem to belie it a bit, but the new administration, the new government of Ethiopia created a Minister of Peace last year. And of course, it has subsequently gone into serious conflict that's existing there. So
there was a Nobel Prize given out to their prime minister, and yet he's now leading a war.
Tigray province.
Tigray. We've gotten some bad reactions after giving out Nobel Prizes because Aung San Suu Kyi kind of let us down. And here comes another one, it sounds like.
What about Obama's prize?
Oh, yeah, right.
He was himself shocked.
Yeah, I know. I wonder what'll come of this initiative in Ethiopia. What was that like, and what was planned, and what do you think is going to come of it?
Well, I mean, it seemed, on paper, it sounded extraordinary because it was all about reconciliation and working with the formerly warring parties. But now we have new warring parties. I don't know where Eritrea is in the current conflict. I'm not sure they are engaged because Eritrea is a separate country, but Tigray is a province of Ethiopia. So, it becomes something else again. But if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a bit about what's happening with Canadian Peace Initiative, because we decided that after those, we know that private members' bills do not typically succeed, very rarely succeed. Mm-hmm. But we know that they create a tremendous platform, and that did happen. But after those two bills did not succeed, we moved in a different direction. And through the help of particularly the MP Boris Chevnevsky, who has been very, very strong, he's now retired, a very strong supporter throughout. He actually spoke, I think in 2000, and I can't remember what year, but after the reading of the speech of the throne, from the throne, the opposition parties have a moment to comment. And he said, Mr. Prime Minister, the thing that's missing here is a minister of peace. And he then began to, after the two failed initiatives for a full department, which was a very ambitious thing to do, he began to work internally, speaking with the PMO and the Minister of International Affairs. And there was an agreement, actually, this is the backstory to the formation of the Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security that we now have in Canada. Jacqueline O'Neill, who has a long history of working in the field of women and peace building, is our ambassador. And that came out of that work that was done, and of course supported by the national women's organizations. Mm-hmm. And that position was installed in June of 2019, June 2019. Unfortunately, we haven't heard a lot from her. And although we know she's met at least 3 times with non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, we still have not seen her active in the world that we're aware of. And we're very much looking forward to her becoming a force for peace for Canada and the world. The other development, and the one that's very interesting, but if you look at the mandate letters of the Minister of International Affairs, there's supposed to be created a Center for Peace, Order, and Good Government, which nothing has happened. Nothing has happened on that front at all. There is not even a director name. Now, as you well know, Meta, that most of the countries, developed countries in the world, have some kind of a standalone national organization that does research into questions of peace and security. Like, of course, one of the most famous one is the Swedish one, CIPRI.
Right.
Most countries
Canada had one for what, 5 minutes back in the 80s. CIPS, Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security, which was headed by Jeffrey Pearson. Remember?
Right.
And that, it must have gone on 5 years or so, do you think? Something like that.
That seems to me to be something of great promise. And there have been a couple of NGO meetings to try and put ourselves to, get ourselves together so that we can make proposals as to what this institution might look like. But I have to say, it's sort of like many other things, it's been kind of, sideswiped, if I might put it that way, by COVID. But nonetheless, we see that this is a real opportunity to form something that would be arm's length from the government, but supported by the government. And we need something like that because, as you know, in that field, Canada has now fallen far behind in many ways in terms of the whole, just being present in the whole global arena on questions of peace and security, except our presence in NATO, which we don't seem to want to question in any way, even to the point of questioning the nuclear first strike policy. That would be a great beginning for us. And of course, we've all talked.
Fabulous, yeah. And in my notion, it's the only justification for staying in NATO. You can make a good case for the idea that you can stay in NATO and use your vote and use your influence to make some changes or demand some reforms. And if you don't do that, there's hardly any justification at all for continuing to belong. But
No,
that's,
exactly. It's essentially an aggressive force in the world. We have to ask,
mhm.
what are troops from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization doing in Syria or Iraq or wherever? It's a force of destabilization. We cannot, and actually, we do not really see how it can continue, except in this way that you mentioned. Of course, many of us have called for the termination of NATO. Our participation in NATO, but rather we've gone in the other direction. We are in compliance with Trump's demand that we invest 2% of our global of GDP into essentially arming ourselves further towards combat. Canada's work and its thrust of our military and the Department of National Defense is towards combat readiness and interoperability with American forces.
Well, yes, and it used to be, there was much more focus on peacekeeping operations.
Those monies need to be diverted back or reinvested in a green recovery. And we've seen statements quite recently which indicate clearly that the government has no intention of reducing expenditures on the military. That those are all going ahead. The ships, the support vessels, and they're still hell-bent on purchasing up to 88 new generation fighter jets, which are still unproven, actually. And especially in Arctic conditions, but it's a whole misdirection of funds and directions for Canada as a middle power. My feeling is, and not only me, but that we need to be building again the non-aligned countries, that we represent a third force which is not playing the game of what is emerging as a new Cold War.
Of course, all of peace workers agree that our emphasis needs to be on diverting money from military expenditures to peaceful expenditures, whether it's green or other kinds of infrastructures or health, whatever we need. There's so many things. And I have had the view all along that instead of just saying, why don't we shift it over, we should be doing as much work on defining what it is we want to shift it to as we do demanding that they shift it at all. In other words, if we just say, why don't you spend more money on something else, that's too vague. We have to say, here's what we want you to spend this money on. Take it out of this particular budget, this fighter plane thing, and spend it on this. And here's how much, here's the list of things we want you to buy, and here's the number of jobs it'll create, and all of that work, which is a work of building an economy. And we need to do those two things together, because if you just make the exhortation, let's spend money on good things instead of bad things, it doesn't go anywhere. So we have to actually get more specific and do the work of saying what needs to be done instead. Trouble is, I just had a talk show with Colin Archer a couple of days ago. He was for 27 years the Secretary General of the International Peace Bureau. And when I made that kind of point to him, he said, yes, but then that means you've got to make a coalition of all the other groups that you want a relationship with, the green groups, whether it's pandemics, whether it's cyber infrastructure, whether it's food and economic development, whether it's energy, whatever it is you're going to do, you have to make a coalition, and then you have to come out with an agreement about how much money is going to go to each of these different groups or projects. And that's where the problem arises. Because if you try to get these people together and specify what you want your money spent on, you'll just create a big controversy among these groups, and you won't get any agreement. That it's hard to build a coalition, and it's hard to get people to agree on an alternative budget. And I think that's the challenge, that we better start paying more attention to trying to do that. Say, for example, what a Green New Deal would actually cost, and what it would look like, and who would benefit from it, and how many jobs we would create. For example, if we want to shut down that plant that makes these armored personnel carriers for Saudi Arabia, we've got to say, well, what are we going to hire these people to do instead? Because there are a lot of jobs involved. So we have to think up an alternative occupation, and how we're going to create an industry that would hire them and so on. Unless we do that, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. But I have to acknowledge that what Colin said is really true. It's hard to get people to agree once you actually get down into the weeds and try to start sorting those things out. What do you think?
Yeah, that is our problem, and I agree. On the other hand, I mean, we've had this work that's gone on for a long time now of the alternative federal budget, for example. That's a very interesting vehicle to work with exactly on these things, because they put dollars and cents behind each of these things. And in the end of the day, there seems to be agreement among the groups that represents an alternative federal budget. So there is some hope that if you're working directly with, where expenditures are proposed and where they could be alternatively, I think there is a vehicle.
Okay. Well, now I think you've actually given me some good corrective information, because although I was aware that there's such a thing as the alternative federal budget, I don't know the first thing about it, which is a bad sign, because I should know, right?
Yeah.
Sorry?
The Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives is the lead organization in that now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's the only vehicle I can think of, and it's been working, and it engages people. I mean, there will be trade-offs between our different organizations, and we may not all see the same priorities.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, when we start thinking about a post-COVID recovery, that's at the heart of it. And to wrest away some of those funds being spent on the military would be a very good place. And I think that, but as you say, then how do you redirect the funds? I think that's a real question. But I think that's a good vehicle that we can actually work with, and it has respect in the field as well.
Well, I did a talk show with Seth Klein a couple of months ago. Right. And of course, he's no longer in his former role. But I think maybe you're right. Let's do some contact building and see whether or not there's a closer way that we can work with those people. Maybe a conversation between the new Canada-wide Peace Network and an organization that is doing that kind of thing, or maybe more than one organization that is trying to do the actual economic calculations for building a budget that would be an alternative, reasonable budget. How about that? Let's work on that, shall we?
Yeah, I'm gonna follow up, and I will be in touch with the CCPA and see. And I think that's a great idea. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you so
much. Have a wonderful holiday.
I will, and you do too.
May peace prevail on earth.
Indeed, and may the pandemic go away. Thank you.
Go away.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.